Kelly.
Hello, everyone. My name is John. Here in a couple minutes. Just want to wait for some other people that are signing in.
Thank you. Mm.
Right, everyone, it looks like we still have a number of people that are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started in about 20 seconds. All right, everyone, why don't we go ahead and get started? There still are some more people that are joining us, but do want to be conscious of everyone's time, and we have a lot of good information to get through today. So I want to thank you for joining Perspectives today. My name is Jonathan Eisler. I'm the Vice President of Organizational Consulting here at Perspectives. Many of you know that we created this series a few months ago, originally as a response to COVID-19. Our intent was to share expertise that would help organizations and individuals navigate the enormous challenges that a pandemic presents to organizations and ultimately to our workforces. Since then, our world has become even more complicated. Actually, better said, the ever-increasing complexity of our world has become even more evident, right? Media is reminding us of the racial inequity and injustice that exists across our country. Then there are the subsequent protests, the calls for justice, the reform, and some violence. And whether these events have directly affected your people or not, every one of us is impacted in some way or another. But as a manager and as a leader of our organization and of our workforces, what can we do about it? Right? We can do nothing and just sit and wait to react to any situation or questions that may come up. Or we can start by conducting awareness trainings for all employees. But that's just the beginning. Ultimately, we need to address the very culture of our organization and focus on long-term diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Now, there's no defined roadmap, if you will, but our virtual workshop today will help us examine each of these possibilities and consider some next steps. Our speaker today is Vanessa Smith. Vanessa is an expert in all things HR, workplace strategy, and she's passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's also an employment attorney too. Some of you may remember her from one of the earlier sessions that we did in this series a few weeks back. At the end of Vanessa's presentation today, we want to open it up for Q&A. So I would ask that you actually just add questions and or comments using the chat feature down on the bottom of our screen here. My screen will go black, but I'll still be here behind the scenes that I can then help at the end of the session to field some of these questions that you submit to Vanessa. And then depending on the amount of time that we have, if we're not able to get to all of your questions in this session, we will also then follow up with some information afterwards to either address the questions and or outline ways that we can continue the conversation offline too. So stay tuned. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But for right now, it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague and my friend, Vanessa Smith.
Hi, thanks so much, Jonathan. I appreciate that. What are we in the afternoon? Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And I think I may be having technical difficulties, but we will soon see. All right. So. Oh, so Jonathan or whomever is sharing their screen, can you guys give me the ability to share mine?
I believe that should be coming now.
Okay. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
We see where it says everything on your screen. There, it's coming in. There you go.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Jonathan, for that backdrop. I think we are all certainly much more aware of the role of just the challenges created around unconscious biases and really just as we look around us at the world and how it has been impacted, a level of awareness around social justice and things of those nature. And so as folks that do work in the workplace, we understand that we want to bring that back and figure out how we as leaders and as employers can address some of these concerns, because obviously if they're going on out in the world around us, they are going to impact us in the workplace as well. So that was really the impetus for us deciding to put on this seminar today. Thank you all for joining. And as Jonathan said, we'll answer questions at the end, but I really wanted to tackle this from the approach of action, right? What action can we take as leaders and as employers to get to tackle this issue, right? I don't know that anyone can fairly say we can get out ahead of it at this point, but certainly to address it as it has now presented itself to us. And so with that being said, we're going to focus on the action. And I really have identified 4. There certainly might be others that you consider. There we go. Okay. So there certainly might be others that you consider, but okay, well, I thought that was, okay. So the first is really a sustainable strategy for a long-term approach to ensuring that there is diversity, equity, and inclusion in your workplace. As Jonathan said, that is really big picture. It is long-term, but from my perspective and our perspective, that should definitely be the goal. So we want to talk about what are some of the key elements of such a sustainable long-term strategy. The second thing we want to do is address the here and now, right? So let's talk about some various types of awareness training that you might want to begin thinking about to host in your workplace, just to bring a level of self-awareness. And when we become more self-aware, we're able to be more intentional about our behavior. The third is to understand the key elements of a responsive approach. So there are many out there who will say, I'll just kind of wait and see what happens and respond to that. And so when you do, there is obviously a right way and a wrong way to do that as well. And then finally is to do nothing, right? And to kind of deal with the organizational impact and potential legal implications of a failure to either address, create a strategy, respond, or even react to the current dynamic. So looking at looking at the definitions of what do we talk about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And they are different things. And, you know, I started doing this work probably 20 years ago, right? When we first learned about the way in which our country was shifting demographically and the fact that there would be new majorities arising in our country, as well as obviously in our workplaces. And at that point, we talked about diversity management, right? And so this idea of having diverse people in the workforce was something that we just needed to sort of manage, right? And the world of diversity work has evolved so much since that time, and no doubt will evolve significantly and exponentially as a result of the current situation that we find ourselves in. But they are different things. So I just wanted to level set around some definitions. So diversity is obviously the state of being diverse, of having variety, right? So it really is about just having different people from different backgrounds, different demographics, different thinking, different gender, gender expression, gender identity, all those things in our workplace. It is very much about that mix and numbers, right? Equity is the quality of giving everyone access to the same opportunities. And I want to distinguish for you the difference between equality and equity. Equality is giving everyone the exact same thing. And equity is making sure that everyone has the same opportunity, right? So there are a lot of different ways to talk about that. One of the most effective that I have seen or heard is an analogy of a hospital setting, right? So we've all been, or maybe not all, but many of us have been to the hospital or an emergency room, right? And if myself and Jonathan both go into the emergency room, and I have, shortness of breath and I'm on the verge of having a heart attack, and Jonathan has a broken arm, well, equality is when we are both given an aspirin, right, to treat that problem. That's equality. We both get the same thing. Equity is giving us both the opportunity to heal and to get better as a result of our injuries. So therefore, we don't need the same thing. We need what we need based on our circumstances, right? And then inclusion is obviously the state of being included within a group and not just having a seat at the table, but having your voice be valued, having your presence be welcomed, and not just tolerated. And so in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, we are fond of the notion that if you create equity and inclusion, diversity will follow. So oftentimes we wonder why we're unable to attract a more diverse talent pool. There are all sorts of strategies around diversity and recruiting and all of that. But the reality is, if you have not created a space where everyone does have the same opportunity to be successful, irrespective of their demographics and irrespective of what they bring to the table based on their specific circumstances, and everyone feels valued and welcomed, then those people will come. Everyone will come and everyone will want to work in your organization. So diversity will follow. So I really like to capture this around the idea of an employee experience. That is a little bit of a buzzword in the world right now, but it really is real. Like, I believe that experience, really trumps everything. The experience that you're having in any given situation is what you remember. It is what you take away from that experience, from that opportunity, and it is what most impacts you as a human being in the world, right? The experience that you have. So in our workplaces, we really want to focus on creating a culture of belonging. Having equity, having a sense of inclusion brings diversity, and all of that creates a culture where everybody truly feels they belong. And quite frankly, if you have a culture where people feel that they belong, we know that the research shows that people who have, we call it employee engagement, but people who feel like they belong in an organization are much more productive. They bring their best selves to the workplace. They bring that energy that they might otherwise use elsewhere. They bring it to work as opposed to doing the bare minimum or just phoning it in. So creating that culture of belonging is really important. And I'm pretty sure you guys will get these slides, so I won't talk a lot about this, but this is really just the lessons from other leaders about the importance of the employee experience. And the one that most spoke to me is the last one, right? That talks about the hallmark of a healthy culture. In this case, this is from Pixar, so they were talking about a creative culture, but I believe that it applies to any organizational culture, is that its people feel free to share ideas, opinions, and criticisms. So bring your best everything, not just the good stuff, but the stuff that makes us grow, the stuff that builds our muscles where we might be weaker as an organization. Bring the criticism too. That lack of candor, if unchecked, ultimately leads to dysfunctional environments. And quite honestly, guys, that is a lot of what we are seeing right now, is environments that were already dysfunctional. A situation like this just lifts the lid right off of that dysfunction. And now some of those environments are, quite frankly, in chaos as a result of that. So what are some of the key elements of our strategic approach? Well, as with anything, it starts with your core values. So I was on a leadership training this morning, and someone asked the question, well, how do we know what to say, right? And it is a difficult thing to do, but it's an easy answer because it comes from your core values as a company, right? It comes from your values as an individual. That is how you know what to say, because when you're in a tough spot, that is what comes out, who you really are. So as a company, look back to your core values. I just have started working with a client who has realized that their core values got them into quite a bit of a mess. And they have made the very difficult, but I think right decision to say, we'll get rid of those too. Like, just because these were our values back 20 years ago doesn't mean that they really reflect who we are as a company today. So we're going to scrap this and we're going to start all over. But that is where you start, with your core values. Secondly, it is so important to get input from your people. So in the HR world, we call this employee surveys, employee engagement surveys, all of those types of things that allow your people to share what their experience is with your organization. We also call it exit interviews for those people who have chosen to move on from your organization. What can they teach us about what they have experienced that might provide lessons learned for you to make shifts and make adjustments? You really want to develop that infrastructure that is centered in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all aspects of your organization. Sometimes we look so carefully at the people role or the HR function of our organization as the place where all that is housed. But for those of you who are running and operating high-performing organizations, you know that you cannot separate any part of your business from any other. They all have to go together, right? Marketing has to go with sales, has to go with the budget, has to go with finance, has to go with operations. They all have to work in concert. And the same is true with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that too has to be a part of all aspects of your organization. It has to be fully integrated and part of the very fabric of your organization in order for it to have the impact that you might want it to have. You've got to educate people. So, we're going to talk about some training opportunities, but obviously even attending sessions like this to educate yourself about what are some other folks doing out there in the world that we might be able to take advantage of. So education is a key element of that strategy. Communication, and more communication, right? You really can never over communicate what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I think they say you have to say something 8 times in order for people to really get it. So if that's the research, you probably need to do twice that much, right? So really communicating your plans, your vision, your values, and your intention is really important. Sixthly, you want to measure success. How do we know it worked? How do we know that we made any progress? Did we make any progress? Did we make the progress that we expected to make, or was it something completely different? Sometimes that's okay, but as long as you are intentional around making sure that you are achieving something, that is really an important part of any strategy. And then finally, continual improvement. So applying the lessons learned to improve, close gaps, and just continue the journey forward. So that is the key elements of a sustainable long-term strategy. Again, it is broad, it is all-encompassing, it is long-term. So it's not a marathon. I mean, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, right? It is a journey. And every company enters that journey at a particular point in time. The importance of getting that input and doing that assessment work is understanding and being very honest about where you are. Again, client that I've started working with has literally said to me, we will tear it up, meaning tear up their infrastructure and the way that they've done business in order to prevent it being torn down. And by that, they mean that if we don't get this right, we won't have a business anymore. We won't have people that will want to work here and support this business. And so in that way, I know in HR, we use the word mission critical a lot, but in that way, for them, it is truly mission critical. So you need to do that hard work of assessing where this fits in for you and where your company is already on this journey. All right, so shorter term approaches include cultural awareness approaches. So this is all about bringing awareness to us individually as well as a community, as an organization. I sort of broke this up into three different parts. Some internally focused awareness. So understanding the impact of unconscious bias on how we operate in the world, understanding the foundation and how white supremacy impacts who we are as a country, and understanding how our privilege, as well as our fragility in many respects, impacts how we both respond, how we approach, as well as how we react to various situations. So those types of trainings are all very introspective. They are all requiring those who are attendees to look at themselves and to assess who am I in this space and how can I do something different, right? And that difference may be, well, we'll talk about solutions in a second. So the second piece is really externally focused awareness. And this is awareness of others. So this is understanding more about different cultures, right? This is the baseline of understanding that, blackface is never okay, right? Or that the use of the N-word, irrespective of how many times you may hear it in a song, or people who were at one point abused by that word, using that word and appropriating that word in a way that for some gives them power, that's never okay, right? So simple things like that may help impact behavior and help people to say, oh, yeah, I shouldn't do that, and I won't do that, and I certainly won't do that in this organization. Historical awareness, part of the conversation we had this morning, was coming off of this weekend and an awareness of the meaning of the Juneteenth holiday, which was last Friday, June 19th, Juneteenth, the impact of activity that was going on in and around Juneteenth and in and around Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the history and the meaning behind that for many people. And just, if you know that this race massacre occurred back 99 years ago, and if you know that an area that was called Black Wall Street was literally burned to the ground, then how does that impact your view of where you might see African Americans in Tulsa today, right? How would lives be different if those businesses had been allowed to thrive for the last 4 generations or 3 generations, right? And how was the fact that they were burned down in the way that they were, and people left literally with the clothes on their backs, how has that impacted that community today? Right, many, many other examples of that. This morning we talked about redlining and sentencing practices and things like that, right? So having that historical awareness of what has transpired before today, is eye-opening for a lot of people to say, wow, when I think about it that way, I might not be as judgmental about where someone is and why they haven't been able to just work hard and get to where I am because I have a certain privilege that they might not have. Microaggressions, helping people to understand, again, just manage and modulate your behavior in a way that does not create harm, right? That causes the least offense to the least amount of people. And then solutions, right? Talking about cultural agility. So how do we start to solve for some of these things that, again, in many cases are unconscious? Cultural agility training. I've seen ally training. So that's a big term right now, is having folks be allies in some of these movements, if you will, as well as the newest term that I kind of like is being an accomplice. It's more than just being an ally and saying, I'll support you from afar. It's getting in there side by side and doing this very, very, very difficult work that we now realize is far from done, and that we all need to either be a part of the solution. I always say, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? So how can we all be part of the solution? Just a little bit about unconscious bias. The most important thing being that it is unconscious, right? And so because it is unconscious, we all have these biases, right? We all have lived, and grown up in the educational system. A lot of the comments this morning was like, I never heard of that. Well, you haven't, right? It wasn't that you weren't paying attention. You haven't heard of it because that is part of the system, right? That if you don't know about that history, then you can ignore it or dismiss it or just be kind of unaware of it, right? But the brain can only consciously process about 40 pieces of information per second, right? But yet we're taking in all this information. And so the neurological system just cannot process it all. And so we have all these unconscious things that we're processing, about 11 million, right? As opposed to the 40 that we're aware of. There's all this other stuff in the background. And so what our brain does is it takes shortcuts to just make things easier. So we lump things together, we group things together, we form ideas and judgments and stereotypes and all of those things, because it just makes our brain do a lot less work, right? And but that is, again, something that we have to undo very intentionally. Microaggressions. This is a term that you may have heard, you may not have heard, but it is really it is the subtlety of systemic isms, right? It is not the big moments where we all, decide, oh my God, that was horrible, what happened to George Floyd. It is the Amy Cooper situation, right? It is even not even that tangible in many instances. Those brief, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental situations that create indignity and that dehumanize people. And so particularly impacts culturally marginalized groups, although it can happen in any sort of space, right? Those are just some examples of microaggressions that, again, awareness training, we can have a 3-hour session on just all the microaggressions that exist out there, right? That we don't even necessarily think about. And if you do that and 25% of your attendee population stop saying at least 25% of those things, that's pretty huge. That's important, and that is definitely progress. Cultural agility, so this is the solution-oriented piece of it, is really the ability to recognize. So you want to recognize those different worldviews and to be able to respond in ways that are relevant and will generate positive responses, right? I know that I often hear about a fear of, am I going to get it right? Or am I going to say the right thing and things like that? Well, maybe you will, maybe you won't, but the more practice makes better, right? And so we all want to have positive responses because the intention is usually a positive one, right? So we want to have positive responses, and cultural agility helps us to get better about that. So on the pathway to competence, Responding to that requires intentional practice and effort. And we go from a space of unconscious incompetence, which is in the far right corner, which is basically you don't know what you don't know, right? To a place of conscious incompetence. I will tell you, there are a lot of people operating in this space right now. It is really uncomfortable, right? But to go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, something has to happen, right? There has to be some awareness that comes into focus for you that allows you to say, I had no idea. Well, now you know. That's the conscious part, but you still don't know what to do about it, right? The bridge from conscious incompetence to conscious competence is really education. It's training, it's learning, it's reading, it's talking to people, it's being intentional about who you put in your world, and who can help you to become competent in what you were previously incompetent about. And then after you do that enough, meaning like decades of just being really intentional and conscious about being competent, then in some spaces, you may move into unconscious competence. We all have blind spots. And even though I have been doing this work for a couple decades now, there are places where I have blind spots, right? And there are there's new information that is coming to me frequently, that means that I have to keep pushing myself in the direction of that competence in all areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. All right, so we've talked about long-term strategy, we've talked about short-term training. The third thing that you can do, right, to address these issues is really to be responsive, right? And in being responsive, oh gosh. In being responsive, you are, did I lose my screen? I'm sorry, guys. Can you guys still see my screen?
Yep, we can still see it. We
Okay,
see
perfect.
the elements of EGM.
Okay, great.
Vanessa, you are muted right now.
Okay, sorry. So responsiveness means that when you have a concern be raised, that you have a response to it, right? And you have a strategic response to it. And so we call that employee grievance management, right? So when complaints, concerns are raised in the workplace, you have to be able to respond to them. And so for many of us, that looks like an investigation and things like that, right? So these are just the elements of what we have found to be a successful program. Again, aligned first and foremost to your core values, right? So you want to have a policy that explains what it is. You need a procedure. How are we going to implement that? You have to allocate the resources to do it properly. There needs to be a governance structure and some oversight, right, to ensure that there's consistency and fairness and equity in the process. And then you need to measure your success. So even in responding, let's not let our response be random or haphazard or perhaps different from situation to situation. Let's be even if we take the approach that we're not going to do anything proactively, we're not going to offer any training, these issues will likely come up in your workplace at some point or another. And so have a way to thoughtfully and strategically respond to those issues. And that is the intention behind the creation of an employee grievance management process, or goes by many different names, but something that allows you to respond, again, consistently, with compliance and fairly across all situations that arise. Okay. And then finally is the idea of doing nothing. I'm sorry, finally is the idea of doing nothing. And The real problem with doing nothing is, you sort of leave it to chance how it's all going to work out for you. And there we go. Okay. So there are just 4 things in particular that I have found result from doing nothing. And that is lawsuits, right? And lawsuits that look like claims of harassment, claims of discrimination, claims of retaliation, or more recently, as we have started to require companies to share pay information and the like, claims of pay inequity that are based on some sort of systemicism. And so, again, that's an option as well. And certainly that will happen as I happen to be part of the employment law community as well, trained as an employment lawyer and still work in that space. And we are definitely anticipating, first as a result of COVID, quite frankly, but secondly, as a result of all of the civil unrest and social justice awareness that has come forth in the last 3 weeks or so, we are also expecting a significant rise in employment litigation and employment law complaints as a result of both of those things separately and together. So the organizational impact, of course, of doing nothing is you just lose good people, right, who want to be associated with organizations who are taking a stand, who are doing something that matters to them. On the call this morning, we talked about so many of the companies who have come out and taken strong stances around social justice, and how we feel about those companies, right? And the ones who have not. And for many people, that is as good a reason as any to not support them because they feel like they're on the wrong side of this issue or on the wrong side of history. So you lose people. There's lowered morale, obviously, when those types of issues are happening. People are sad to come to work. They're just not, they're not happy. Workplace conflict, those conflicts between peers that escalate from maybe personality or something that was said or done into something that becomes much bigger. There can be mistakes and errors that are made, and forgive the word medical there, that should not be in this presentation, but mistakes and errors. And of course, I said legal claims against the company. And remember, harassment, discrimination, retaliation, those issues, while company focused, the action that lead to those types of claims can also represent claims against the individual. So things like assault, battery, if there's a touching, things like that, right? So there can also be claims against the individual. And so where I would just want to leave this, so we've covered all 4 things, right? Hopefully you got all that: the strategic part, the awareness part, the response part, and the we'll just wait and see part, right? And I think in all of those, what I keep hearing as I talk to clients, and again, I keep referring to the training that we did this morning because it just happened and it was such a powerful training for the future leaders of our client, is that discomfort is just the new normal, right? Whether you choose to be strategic, that's hard. That is hard work, right? Looking at yourself with such a level of introspection and humility that you say, wow, we have done this wrong. As we were having the training this morning, I got a letter from the head of school of my daughter's school that was literally that exact letter, right? And it almost brought me to tears, because the humility that I know that it took for her as a leader to acknowledge, we have not gotten this right as a school community, and we're going to do better to ensure the inclusion and sense of belonging for all of our families, was pretty powerful, right? So that's not comfortable. It's going to be just uncomfortable. If you choose to take the training approach, I mean, sitting in some of that training, again, this morning, we just all decided we needed a break. Like, the conversation was so powerful and so intense and so uncomfortable and so meaningful that when we got through it, we just collectively, like, all needed to just kind of woosah for a moment, right? So that's not comfortable. Talking about privilege and bias and your own world and all of that is not comfortable. If you take the approach of being responsive, that also isn't comfortable, because that means somebody has raised a complaint internally, right? At least it's internal, so we appreciate that. But having to respond to that and finding out and peeling back those layers and uncovering whatever you may not have known, right, is also uncomfortable. And then, of course, doing nothing. If you find people going to outside agencies and filing complaints and lawsuits, that's not comfortable either. Nobody wants that, right? So I think just acknowledging that this is a moment in history, quite frankly, and generations to come will look back on this as to what we did or what we didn't do and how it all worked out, right? Whether a change was made or not. But in this moment, we are all going to be uncomfortable. And so I think just getting comfortable with discomfort is really the new normal, and kind of what I want to leave you with, that as you go through this process, and regardless of what you choose to do, just know that the discomfort means you're doing something. And so for that, I applaud you, including even just getting on this call. So with that, I do know that there are some questions. I've seen a couple of them pop in. So I will stop talking and hear questions from you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vanessa. I really like how you wrapped that up here at the end about just do something, right? And if you're not part of the solution, we're part of the problem, as you said. And I'm looking over here at my notes. Being an accomplice, that's a great reframing versus just an ally from afar, because it implies action, right? And it implies support. So very nice job on how you wrapped that up and really tied it all in together here at the end. And it's a nice lead into some of these questions that we have that have come through too. I want to start off with one here, and this one was set privately to us, so I'll keep their name out of it, but I really respect this individual's candor and willingness to be open in this very question here. So the question says, forgive my ignorance, but why is articulate a microaggression? I've heard this before, but I'm not sure I understand it. I'm not at all articulate, so I tend to recognize it in others. So maybe you can say a little bit more about this. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. The general thought behind that is that the need to say that implies a belief that that person would not have been articulate, right? So on some level, we assume that people that we come into contact with, certainly in certain spaces, will be articulate, right? They have gotten to that space because of their command of the English language and because of their use of the dictionary and understanding and proper use of words, right? And so to make that comment often comes with a little bit of a, oh, wow, they're so articulate, right? And so the assumption is that they would not be because of most often race, right? So I think it came to national attention when that comment was made about future President Barack Obama, right? So here's a man who's been a congressman, a senator, or state senator, a U.S. senator, and is running for president. Of course he's articulate, right? That it goes without saying. And so the fact that there's a need to say that is why it is considered a microaggression.
That's helpful. And I'm reminded too, I think by very definition, the term is it's what's aggressive about is what's not being said.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Another question here. How do you suggest organizations address internal investigations regarding racial or gender pay discrepancies?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to do the work on that. So that's where that strategic grievance management comes into play. We talked about the pay inequities there. So you have to do a pay equity analysis to determine if there is some some bend towards paying people of a certain, I think you said race, so race at a lower at a lower rate. You know, we know that from a gender perspective, that has historically been the case, and that is why you have seen many states ban the use of prior salary information when going through an interview process. Illinois is one of those, because we know that when you start out at a lower pay rate, right? So I don't forget the numbers. I think it's 78%, right? Women make 78 cents to the dollar for men. When you start out there, that just progresses throughout your career. And so by the time you've had a 30 or 40-year career, you have made significantly less, right, than a male counterpart. And so for that reason, many states, Illinois included, have banned the use of prior salary information to determine a person's pay. The reality is in HR, what do we say? A job has a certain value, right? Whatever that value is, whatever your pay range is, that is based on the marketplace and your compensation strategy. So why would you ever be paying anyone outside of that range, right? And so obviously within that range, it's still a range. So you may not have people making the exact same thing, but they should all be within that range if that is the work that they are doing. So yes, I think you have to do the work. I think you have to, there's a subjective, qualitative part of it that involves just understanding people's perspective. Like, why do you perceive that there is pay inequity based on race? Are you talking to people? Is it glass? Like, where is that coming from? Because sometimes it's just not accurate. And sometimes it's easy to say, no, you actually make the exact same thing, right? Or B, no, they make something different because they had 30 years of experience and you were brand new, right? Things like that. So you have to do a qualitative part of it, but then the biggest part of any sort of pay analysis is the quantitative part of it, because it is math. And ultimately, people are either being paid in that range or being paid fairly relative to one another, or they're not.
Well said. And you also addressed the follow-up, the question that came through about that around transparency. So
Yeah.
Here's another great question that came in. It said, if there are no people of color who are leading the organization, how can those from the lower level hold the leadership accountable to be inclusive and show equity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you have to lift your voice, right? And so you know, there's a lot of, I've seen a lot of banners and signs around silence, right? Silence is complicity, silence is violence, right? That sort of thing, right? But if you are not lifting your voice, I say this to people all the time in the context of an investigation, an organization cannot know everything that is going on. You need the people in that organization to tell you what is going on. Now, the job of an organization is to make that a safe action for people, right? To make it a comfortable action for people to come forth. But if people don't come forth, you just can't possibly know everything that's going on in your organization, right? So I would say, for more junior people to lift their voice, to come forward, that usually gets the attention of people in today's day and age. Social media is pretty impactful, and a lot of our clients right now are responding to things that have been put on social media relative to their company, and you'd like to try to not have that happen if you can. So go ask, you know what, actually scratch everything I just said, go ask, right? As a leader, go ask those people, what is your experience like here? Like, this is a perfect opportunity to do that. Like, we're seeing all of this happening out in the world, and oh my goodness, right? Who knew? But tell us what it is like here. What is your lived experience in this workplace? And I think you, regardless of the answers you get, it will be educational. And I will caveat that by saying, if you get answers that say you need to make some changes, go in with some level of commitment to do that. Because as we all know, the worst thing in the world you can do is ask people for their opinion and then not take it or ignore it, right? So anyway, sorry.
So we have some more questions coming in here. Let's have time for one more. And Just as a quick reminder too, in our follow-up to this, so we will be sending around the recording for the entire session. You will also have my direct contact information. I would love to have a more of a detailed conversation about even some of these other questions that I see coming in, but to have a deeper conversation as well about how Vanessa and our consulting group specifically is helping organizations with everything from longer versions of like today's conversation to ones that we're customizing for our customers, and also really looking at that organizational strategic cultural aspect that we're talking about as well too. So we'd love to continue this conversation offline, and I would encourage anybody to reach out to me directly with my information that you will have after this. So our last question for Vanessa: as an employee with no control over the hiring/promotion process, how can I ensure my organization is equitably promoting minorities to leadership positions? Do you have any advice for how employees can inquire about increased transparency in diverse hiring or promotion practices?
Yeah, and I think the answer is very similar to what I said earlier. So if you're the employee, kind of lifting your voice, raising these issues. I mean, no question, HR is not always perfect, but in most cases, HR that I have seen wants to do the right thing. They want to respond to those concerns. So if those concerns are raised, there will be some action taken. Obviously, collective voices can sometimes be more powerful than individual voices. So if there are multiple people in the organization who have this concern coming forth as a group or as a collective, right? With from a place of curiosity, right? Why is this? Help me understand this, right? And just raising those issues. And then if you are leadership, I would say again, go and ask those questions, right? And one of the things that I'm seeing quite a bit of right now is having a more diverse group of people as part of a hiring committee or hiring team, right? So making sure that there is representation from not only different parts of the organization operationally or functionally, but also different demographic groups as part of those committees and or hiring groups, particularly for leadership positions, right? I'm not suggesting you should have 10 people, to hire every position, but for key leadership roles in the organization, just even that input, just from a change management perspective, it promotes buy-in from your employees, but it also starts to address some of these issues as well.
I appreciate that, and it reminds me of some of these other projects that we've worked on together, Vanessa. And I'm reminded of, as I've heard you say as well, that the strategy is set from the top, but it's implemented from the bottom.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
So we are out of time. Like I mentioned, please keep an eye out for a link to today's recording, as well as some more information about additional future topics and workshops that we're going to be holding. The next one coming up will be on fighting racism, and specifically what I can do to help, or what we can do to help, I should say. We're also planning a session on mental health as it relates to first responders and everything that our first responders have been dealing with, both pandemic and since. So, like I said, you'll have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out. Love to talk about ways that we are helping organizations and teams address the issues we spoke about today, and really supporting our employees as well. So thanks all for attending. Stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to seeing you on a future session. And thank you again, Vanessa.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.